Hello world, Lisa Friedrichsen, your friend and computer science professor with another short screencast from javascript.info, the modern JavaScript tutorial. In this short screencast, we're going to go back into part 2, where we connect our JavaScript to the browser in the document, and we're in section 2.2, bubbling and capturing. Bubbling and capturing simply refers to when we click on an element on a web page, we must realize that we're actually clicking on multiple elements. And if we click on multiple elements, what order do the events of those elements occur? In the very first little example box, he chose a P inside a div inside a form. And each of these 3 elements has JavaScript attached to it on the onClick HTML attribute. So if I click on the P, which one of these is going to happen first? Because when I click on the P, see how it's a child of div and div is a child of form? If I click on the P, I'm actually clicking on all 3 of these. So does the grandfather, then the father, then the child run, or is it child, then mother, then grandmother? How does this work? If I click on the P, then the alert P happens first, then the alert div, and then the alert form. So what bubbling amounts to is that when an event happens on an element, it runs the code attached to that element, and then its parent, and then its grandparent, and so on up the DOM tree, so that all of the elements that were clicked on run in succession. But we go from inside to out. We go from the most specific element through its ancestor tree, not the other way around. But I thought it would be fun to play with this code in Visual Studio Code, so I basically copied it from his example and pasted it into Visual Studio Code so I could examine it. And my web page ended up looking like this. I've got an embedded style sheet on the universal selector. I've thrown a 20 margin pixel in just to make it more obvious. On the body, I've got a blue border. On the form div and P, I've got a red border. And for everything with a class of square, I've given a background color of yellow. So that's what this little web page ended up looking like. I've also used his inline JavaScript method, console log, instead of alert, those same messages. So right now, my page looks like this. If I click on the P, I'm console logging out. I clicked on the paragraph, then the parent, the div, then the grandparent, the form, and then the great-grandparent, the body. And so it's working the same way, and that's called bubbling, going from inside to out. I thought I just got done in the previous lesson explaining why these inline scripts are bad news, because they mix your HTML together with your JavaScript, which makes it hard to maintain the code and read the code. Now, it works well for this little bubbling demonstration. I thought it might be illustrative to break that out into add event listeners, as I encourage you to do in the previous lesson. So let's do that. First, I'm going to comment this out and see how this looks when I use add event listener code. Here's basically the same web page, only without all the inline JavaScript. I've taken that inline JavaScript and I put it in an embedded script. And if it were a perfect world, we'd put this in an external script, but I want to examine the HTML and the JavaScript side by side, so I went ahead and put this in an internal script. And so I've got my same elements, my form, my div, my P. I've classed them square with the same text. So let's look at the script. First of all, if I want something to happen to the body or the form or the div or the P, I've got to identify it in my JavaScript. And if I had them ID'd, I could use the getElementById method. But I don't have them ID'd. So I decided to use the getElements plural by tag name method. And when we use that method, it returns a node list. And so we use the getElementsByTagName method. We give it a element name as its argument, and we know it returns a node list. And even if that node list has only one item in it, we have to refer to which item we want. And I want the first item. I want the first body tag, even though it's a little bit illogical because we always only have one body tag. But with the getElementsByTagName method, I still am returning a node list, so I'm going to have to refer to the first item in that node list, and that's going to be position 0. So that's what I've done on all 4 of these statements. I'm using the getElementsByTagName method to find my first body element. I'm adding an event listener to that element. I'm going to listen for the click event. And then the second argument we know is a function name. I've not created the functions externally to this statement. So another thing you'll often see is An anonymous function, a function without a name, simply passed directly into that second argument. And at first that looked really weird to me because I'd never seen a function passed in as an argument to a method before, but you can do that in JavaScript. So there's my function, my anonymous function. Doesn't have a name, it's just a function. And inside the curly braces, here's what I want that function to do. I want to console log, you clicked on the body. And so that basic pattern I've used for all 4 of these elements, and I'm going to save and refresh and click the div, and I can see that bubbling is still occurring. The div was logged, then the form, then the body. It's going up the DOM tree. If I click on the P, I get all 4. Okay, fantastic. So bubbling versus capturing. Here's what bubbling versus capturing is. Inside the addEventListener method, I've only got 2 arguments now. The first argument is what are we listening for, the click event. And then after that comma, here's the function that runs. And then after that, I can add another comma and use a Boolean argument of true. By default, the argument is false, which is bubbling. But if you change that third argument to true, now you are in capturing mode, and it's going to run the ancestors first before the children. So I'm going to save that code. I'm going to refresh. I'm going to click on the P, and now we're going from the outermost ancestor, the great-grandparent, to the grandparent, to the parent, to the child. That's capturing. Running the events in the opposite direction from innermost to outermost. Now we're going from outermost to innermost. Lesson explains that this is a very rare thing to do and gives you some examples of when you might want to consider this. But for the most part, bubbling is the default third argument, and bubbling equates to false. So sometimes you'll see code that has an explicit false here, but it's not necessary because false is the default third argument and false is bubbling. So if I put falses in there, save, refresh, click my P, now I'm back to bubbling versus capturing. I've got one other script that I've copied in from his lesson into this Visual Studio Code that I wanted to work with, that I think it's fun to rewrite scripts in different ways. So for those of you that are not familiar yet with arrow functions or these template strings, I thought let's try and rewrite this in a way that uses the older traditional techniques, even though we should be going to arrow functions and template literals as soon as we can, because that is definitely the future. But you see a lot of code written both ways, and I think it's really helpful to run it both ways to see how this is going to work. So he's declaring a for loop and using the let and of keywords to declare a variable named ELEM and run this code against ELEM for everything in this node list. Now I thought that was really bizarre. Document.querySelectorAll asterisk. That's going to select every single element. So I rewrote that query selector all and went against the square class just because the asterisk node list is going to return every single element on the web page, whether you want it or not. Whereas the square node list would just return the items that have a class equals square. So I've got a little bit more control if I use a class name here in my query selector all method versus asterisk. So I just thought that right there was kind of really weird. Then he's basically just running event listeners both with the capturing method and with the default false bubbling method, and then alerting out the word capturing and the element's tag name. So if we construct that, the first line is the exact same, except I'm using the square class, and I've used my variable name as the word element versus ELEM. So for each element in this node list, and it's going to be 4 things because I've classed 4 things as square, I'm adding the event listener, I'm listening for the click event, and then I'm passing in an anonymous function, which is what he's doing right here. He's even using a little e for the event argument, which is sometimes used in the code. But if you're not going to use that, you don't need to include it in your function description. And the event object is an important object. We're going to talk about it more because it gives you a lot of information about what has been clicked. But in this case, all we need to do is just put that statement in, and I've rewritten his template literal string as a console log instead of as an alert. and I've used the text capturing that to the element's tag name, and I'm going to go true on the third argument of the addEventListener method. So I'm going to be capturing versus bubbling. So let's see how this runs. I'm going to comment out his example, save, refresh my page, and click my P. And now my console is logging out, capturing body, form, div, P, because the element.tag name comes through in this part of the statement. If I remove the true argument here, and I best change this to bubbling, save and refresh, and now I'm bubbling in from the P to its parent, its form to the body. Thank you.